Well, let's start with the basics, Stuart. Jacques Rancière still alive, which is a rarity for a philosopher, and he's I suppose he's one of the last of that generation of sort of great French
Yeah.
philosophers.
I mean, he's the real deal, right? I mean, he met them all. He knew them all. I
Yeah,
mean, he's a walking piece of history, literally, right? No, but really, like, with no disrespect, I mean, he's the real deal for sure. Yeah,
yeah, he's in his 90s, isn't he? I think, or
85.
thereabouts. He's 85. Oh, okay. Sorry, Jacques, if you're listening.
Well, and the
Yeah,
crazy thing is, right? He's still. I don't know where he gets the energy from. He's doing talks, he's doing
he's
lectures,
active. Yeah,
interviews that get published or don't get published, but like interviews. Uh, um, he wrote a book even I think last year on certain times. He had a book published. I mean, he's full steam ahead.
yeah. So
Amazing.
it's kind of like him and Badiou are the last of that sort of that intellectual generation, that post 1968 intellectual generation, your Derridas, your Foucaults, and your Deleuze's, and all that. They seem to be the last that are carrying the flame.
Yeah, I mean, you got like new people like Meyasu and so on, but it's different
Mm.
kind of yeah. But I mean, Zizek's not really part of that, but he's getting on now, and he's like a living philosopher as well.
He's in his 60s, isn't he? He's a whippersnapper, young
Yeah. He's
whippersnapper.
a young lad. He's a young lad.
Yeah. Um. So, like, well, that's where he is now. I suppose I don't know how prominent or well known he is. He is well known in continental circles, Jacques
What
Rancière.
Roncier or
Yeah,
I
Rancière
think
is well known in continental philosophy circles. But like, let's go back to the start. Like, how did like no, he grew up in Algeria. So like, how did Rancière's early life in Algeria? How was that formative?
well, I'm going to have to disappoint you with that one because he was born there, but when he was about 2, his family moved to Paris, right? And anticipating this question, I had to look at a very good book for those who don't know Roncier called The Method of Equality, which interviews he gave this in one book. And he talks a little bit about this, but he basically says he left at 2. 2 years old, it really didn't have any effect on him. And the only connection he had with Algeria was like more as an academic and as someone who was into emancipation, revolution, and so on. As a little aside, Camus, Derrida were also born in Algeria, as was Louis Althusser, who I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about, who was his teacher at a university, and even Saint Augustine was born there.
As was Saint Augustine, I was about to say, yes, he's the protogenitor. Yeah, I didn't know that actually. So it didn't have a formative influence in the same way as it had for Derrida, who was there until he was, I think he was like a teenager or something like that, or he qualified after his school exams. Yeah, so he moved to Paris then, and I think probably one of the big influences on him was well, what was he doing in Paris? Let's start with that. What was his intellectual formation in Paris?
Thinkers of his kind of genre, if you like. He went to excuse my bad French pronunciation, but the École Normale Supérieure, you can say it better than me, go for it. Like Foucault and so many others went to that university. Like Foucault as well. I mentioned Foucault because, as you know, in my book, I connect Foucault and Rancière. His teacher was Louis Althusser. I mean, I use the term teacher loosely because according to Rancière, Althusser didn't give many classes. He was kind of more that figurehead name, and he arranged for guest speakers and so on. So it's teacher, but I use the term lightly. And like Foucault before him, he in 1968 moved away from the university, moved away from Althusser. He was one of Althusser's star students, star pupils, because he wrote a piece contributing to the book by Althusser, Reading Capital, which was about Marxist capital. But he moved away from Althusser primarily because of May 68. So one of the things he had against Althusser that he said is Althusser is too theoretical, all theory and no action, and also very didactic, right? That you had to listen to him as
Marxist.
yeah. You said it. Be careful. And
As dogmatic Marxist, let's say.
That's funny, right? Knowledgeable other that, like she says about Marx, right? This other that knows. But because of that, they didn't like May 68, Althusser and the French Communist Party, the PCF. So the reaction was quite bad, right? So Althusser rejected May 68, and the Communist Party actually, took on students to go around the university, Marxist students say, stop all of this now, get back to work, and so on. And even famously, joined with the de Gaulle government to go against May 68, which blew up into, I think, about 2/3 of the working population went on general strike. We all know it's a big deal. It's causing ripples still now, right? So because of that, he moved away from Althusser, and he joined Foucault and others at it's now Paris 8 University, which was kind of formed in the summer of 68, almost as a response to that. Like Foucault before him, that's it. He left Althusser and communism, and then eventually, with time in the early 70s, especially with the revelation of the Russian political camps, the gulags, he moved away from Marxism as well.
Okay, so next question then. I'm trying to think then, Stuart, like that May 68 then seems to be, well, it's a really decisive moment in French philosophy. You get this kind of opposition between revolution and reform, typically.
Yeah.
You got Sartre supporting it, and you got
Yeah.
Foucault saying, well, hold on. Even Lacan is having a go at some of the 68 students, Ricoeur, some of the more conservative continental philosophers. Yet there's also philosophers who are embracing it, like Badiou. So it's a real interesting moment. I want to think about, within this, right, this very
melting pot.
So within this ferment, right, there's a lot of I suppose there's a lot of so this is within this ferment, his political sensibility is forged, and he is a political philosopher of sorts. So I'm trying to, maybe we should start there.
Yeah.
If we're to try and explain Rancière to listeners, what is he doing to really define politics? Because so he's one of the things he's famous for is he doesn't really like the government, and he says he's got this idea of the.
I don't think he's particularly
the
against the
interruption of the
government. Like
sensible order,
he understands
the
the need
existing
for
order.
us
So
to be
can you
governed,
unpack
right?
that, please?
All right, but not like this. As Foucault said, it's not like that. Okay, he understands that. So when he talks about politics as an interruption of the sensible, let's talk about what his definition of politics is. So although he was, involved in May 68 and Althusser, Marxism, he says that he's not a political philosopher. He stopped being a political philosopher. He's a philosopher, if you like, of emancipation, but a new form of emancipation we can delve into further, where it's an aesthetic form of emancipation, an emancipation of the self, if you like. So his definition of politics, his own definition, is politics as dissensus. And as I said, dissensus is his own personal neologism. He takes it from the Latin word dissensus, which means disagreement. So it's this disagreement, between the dissensus and the consensus, which is the aesthetic order of what he calls a police logic, or that stems from a presupposition of inequality, which posits your place and allocates your place via your identity within a distribution of space and time. And politics, the enactment of dissensus, is a disruption of this unequal distribution of space and time and your allocation within it. And this dissensus runs from basically a presupposition of equality, where you're not following the kind of Marxist dialectic where we're moving towards equality, but equality happens here and now, and it happens in the form of dissensus. When you enact dissensus as politics, it's via a presupposition of equality. So for those who don't know Rancière, this might sound the opposite to what he wants, which is very theoretical. So we can give an example in Todd May's book on Rancière, gives the example of a presupposition of equality, of dissensus, of the civil rights movement, when African Americans sat in white-only restaurants and did not demand equality, but presupposed it by sitting there and ordering food. And that would be a prime example of politics, enactment of dissensus for a presupposition of equality, where equality happens here and now in that very act, rather than being something to work towards.
Yeah, that's interesting, because quite often in left-wing politics, there's always demands being issued. There's demands from unions, and maybe they're legitimate as well. But
Yeah.
there's demand to unions, demands to the government, demands to corporations. But this guy is saying something different. He's saying, like, let's correct me if I'm wrong, Stuart. But he's saying we proceed as if we are equal. That's how you begin.
Yeah. It's a beginning, but it's internally a beginning. It's a starting point, but it's forever restarting.
So you say eternal, do you mean like psychological?
No, I mean in the sense that, like, say, for example, you've got like a Marxist or a far left kind of form of emancipation, where there's a telos, right, that we're moving towards. For him, a presupposition of quality is not telic, not atelic, but it's autotelic. It's an end in its own self. So when you presuppose equality, that very act is an end in its own right. Yeah, it's autotelic. Does that sound too jargonish, or?
No, well, yeah. So telic means ends. So just so the audience, self-generating ends, basically. Yeah. So I'm trying to think of other examples, maybe to help me along here. I was thinking maybe something like sort of the gay rights movement, where they adopt the word queer, something like that, where they go, "This is our word. It is no longer a slur or an epithet. It's something that we identify and we own, and we've reconstructed and sort of reclaimed." Would that be an example of the sort that he's trying to talk about? Because he's not doing political theory then in the traditional classical philosophical sense, where you go, this is the best way of organizing society. In fact, it's after the fact. Society is already organized, and he's trying to think about ways in which to make it more equal
and to disrupt it, to make it equal. Yeah, you could kind of say that, Patrick, especially as like how they take the word queer back for themselves, like much like he does with politics, right? And also democracy and other words that he takes for the use of a presupposition of equality. However, when we talk about connections like this, is very important, I would say, that to stress that, like Foucault, he is not a follower of identity politics. It's something he's actually against, because, like Foucault, he thinks it perpetuates the actual taxonomy, right? That oppresses you in the first place. So
the idea, if I follow the argument, I think I understand it. The idea is, and he's probably gotten hot water over this, Stuart, but the idea would be that identity is that which segments, whereas equality is that which, I don't know, generates solidarity or brings people together. Is that the thought?
I think he's talking about, if you think the taxonomy of identity is that which, puts you in your place within this social space and time, right? If we make it really like basic, working class, female, as you said, homosexual, whatever taxonomy you want to use. And so he talks about a disidentification, where we're all on a level playing field, right? Okay, where there's no, the working class and then women's rights, and there's a disidentification and not a perpetuation. I mean, as Foucault has said, you're fighting for the very identity that oppresses you, right? It's kind of, you're perpetuating that form, that medium of oppression, which is your identity.
Would he have anything to say then about economics? Because that's usually the Marxist sort of critique, isn't it? That we need to be economically equal prior to talking about individual liberation. I mean, it's a sort of a big critique of Marxism, that, isn't it? But sort of from more sort of liberal bourgeois types, that it's that economic justice has to precede social justice in a way. So, is there a sense that economic equality is important in this, or can he speak within that to that, perhaps within his philosophy?
He doesn't offer anything anything when it comes to political philosophy in the standard sense, or political or economical emancipation. That's not really at all. That would again be a return to Marx, right? Okay, that's not what he's offering. So maybe this backs up. Why did he move away from Marx eventually? So he went to the archives, much like Foucault did, right? Foucault went to the archives in his move away from Marx. Rancière went to the archives too, and he came across these early 19th century worker poets, as he called them.
This relates. Sorry, Stuart, to cut across you. This relates to his book, Proletarian Nights. Is that
Proletarian Nights? Or there's two versions of another one's Knights of Labour, but yeah. So this is like his second book. His first book was Althusser's Lesson, where he's basically critiquing Althusser and why he moved away. It's quite a short book if anyone wants to read it. It's quite heavy with Marxist critique, though, so it's not the easiest of reads. But the Knights of Labour, yeah, that's his book that he wrote after carrying out years of archival research. And when you've come across these 19th century, early 19th century French worker poets, he found out that they didn't particularly seek, fraternity, equality, and liberty, but they just wanted a reprieve from poverty, and if they could, work itself. There was no real ideology there because a lot of them had suffered deeply from revolution. It was an extreme hardship from them. It didn't seem to take them anywhere. So they then started thinking about, rather than changing the government, working on themselves, right, as an aesthetic practice. Hence Rancière's term, like, of an aesthetic revolution.
Yeah, so it's like the workers. There's something pragmatic about them, and when I say pragmatism, I don't mean like I don't know, like I don't mean like Tony Blair or Bill Clinton or something like that. Sort of centrist pragmatism. I mean more like they're trying to think of concrete ways, material ways to improve their lot, to improve their condition, to make their life more rich and prosperous.
So, I mean, you could see it. Rancière doesn't particularly say this, but you could see it for them in their own mind reconfiguring. And this is just as apt today of what the good life is, right? So today's good life is neoliberal. Make as much money as you can. You might have to work hard, buy as much as you can, and we kind of accept that, right? This is a good life. This is this is what we want. This is what we're told. But it's a formulation where you step back and maybe you work less, so you might have less money, but you have more time. And this is one of the most famous of Rancière's worker poets was Louis Gabriel Gourny. And he said, in a nutshell, what is work? It's giving your time away, right? Your loss of time. So Gourny himself talks about a cenobitic economy where he lives as cheaply as possible, so he could take more time off work, and he could do that which he actually desires, right? Which was not to work. He was a parquet floor layer, which is really hard work. You're on your knees all day long, laying these parquet floors, right, in an opulent house. And this kind of gave Rancière the idea of a new form of revolution, right? An aesthetic revolution rather than a political revolution per se, because after May 68, which unfortunately was amazing, but unfortunately didn't work, there was a disillusionment of sorts, like where Marxism, and so on, and communism. It was looking for a new means of emancipation, and much like Foucault, it was an aesthetic means.
Well, he's not a million miles moved from Jean-Francois Lyotard either. There, remember, Lyotard was part of socialism or barbarism, and he meant that like it's either socialism or barbarism. But he was he was quite specific about that. Like, and he's probably not wrong in the long arc of history, but it was he did turn to the aesthetic, Lyotard. So I'm now. Well, I do want to get to that, but there's a couple of more political concepts I want to get through.
So there's a lot.
So there's So this idea, he's got this idea of unverifiable equality. Now I can see automatically my sort of my inner Marxist radar goes up and says, you know, in Marx, it's like, you know, Marx doesn't, when he talks about class, he's not really talking about going around bean counting and saying, oh, you got X amount of money and you get this amount of money. Like, you know, he's not saying everybody is flat equal. That would be
Impossible.
ridiculous. I think you often hear it proposed in the terms of equality of outcome and sort of equality of opportunity in that type of language. But I'm not sure that's what Rancière do. But I'd like you to sort of maybe explain what does he mean, or what's adventitious about this idea of unverifiable quality. This idea of the part of no part, right? That's one of the things he returns to.
Okay, so he talks about that you can't verify equality empirically, which is basically what you've just said yourself, Patrick. So you two are incongruents, two great thinkers. But
flattery will get you
well,
everywhere.
you never know. So, but what he does say, we can take a presupposition of equality. So, for me, and I could be wrong, I'm sure you know much more about Marxism than I do. For me, Marxism is almost like a supposition of equality. Yeah, one day we can all be equal. Yeah, whereas Rancière presupposes equality. Says no, we are equal. Right? There's a nuance, but a very big difference between supposition and presupposition.
Yeah, does it link into kind of like human rights language? Because like human rights language is, we are inalienably equal. That's axiomatic almost. It's something that doesn't have to be disputed prior to any form of political intervention or political classification.
I think it's a little bit different because, you know, like you had the human rights movement after communism with the new philosophers in France, right?
Which was effectively a reactionary movement, yeah.
Yeah, but then Rancière, of course, he's not against human rights. You know, you have to be mad to be against. But he was against that movement because he said, just like the Marxists, right? All of a sudden, you're this all-knowing other that's going to help these poor people who apparently can't help themselves or understand the situation. So we have to be careful with maybe linking them together. But I mean, maybe we can. His presupposition of quality comes from two aspects, right? So there's a presupposition of aesthetics, which you got from the work of poets we spoke of, right? That these people can create. We can create. They were work of poets. They wrote poetry. Gournay called himself a plebeian philosopher. He wrote philosophy too, and enacted it in his life, as did other work of poets. And we could create aesthetically. There's the quality there for everyone, right? But also as well, he talks about in his book, which was the fourth book, right? The Ignorant Schoolmaster. It's his fourth book. He talks about the 19th century pedagogue Joseph Jacotot, who, through his method of teaching French, showed there is like a supposition of an equality of intelligence. So he runs with that supposition of an equality of intelligence to come to a presupposition of equality. And when he talks about the supposition of intelligence, he says, I'm not saying necessarily that we do have, but what if this world existed and manifested with that as a presupposition that we are all equal? How would the world be then? And he runs with this, and we've got this presupposition of equality where we can act as if we are equal in whatever stance that might be. You might be this Tate University, the first year student, and this certain name you're speaking, and you speak out with something and you're brave and you presuppose your equality to do so, right? Yeah, well, that happens in university. That's one example of many, but Todd May's civil rights movement is another. Or you could even say Gournay, right? Gournay had an appalling education. You know, he's in poverty. He's a working class in early 19th century Paris, and he published poetry. He read philosophy. He became self-employed. He presupposes equality in doing that. So, as Rancière said, if it sounds like this, Rancière's philosophy is very much for the individual. But because of that, there's a kind of movement by Zizek and others kind of against this, where this is active dissensus, but it doesn't really go anywhere. There's no telos. There's no negation of the negation, leading to a supposition, like you get in a Hegelian dialectic. It doesn't do anything. Yeah, there's just a big display of dissensus on where does it go. So there's a critique against that, which I disagree with. But that's kind of where he's coming from with this form of equality.
Well, this makes sense then, because he's trying to disrupt hierarchy then as well, and this is he's quite famous, I think, and maybe you can shed light on this, on critiquing technocratic forms of governance,
Yeah.
like Foucault, I guess, as well. Which,
Yeah.
I mean, of course, that's you've published a book on both those figures. But
Yeah.
so the notion, he's very, and I was interested to see this because he did talk about, during the COVID pandemic, he did talk about this, the notion of expertise. He wants to disrupt that idea that
Yeah.
experts are, in some sense, deserved of a higher status by virtue of being experts, let's say.
Yeah.
So, don't want to put you on the spot here, Stuart, but does that then mean, is it, he doesn't seem to strike me either as an anti-vaxxer, for example. So how does he sort of tread that needle? I mean, he has written on the COVID-19 pandemic, like, how does he say, how does he put the populace, the demos, which
People.
which he's very supportive of, how does he put that in, I suppose, authentic expertise? I think that would be the idea, because that's what he's doing with the Knights of Labour, isn't it, or the proletarian Knights, that he's showing that they too can be experts, which is your point, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that this all goes back to Althusser, right? The expert. Yeah, I know why you do May '68. It's a petty bourgeois revolution. You shouldn't be doing that now, right? Well, you don't understand. Listen to me. Come back to the lecture. And we get this nowadays, right? Like with politicians, people don't understand it. We've got to run the government this way, and we get that with science very much, right? The new religion. Not that I'm against science, I'm not. But so he's saying that one of the keys for him is, and this is why he doesn't try to offer a way forward, say, like, for example, like Marx would, because he believes in autodidact. So this being self-taught, which is kind of stems again from Jacato, as we were saying, right? Where his students were able, he showed them they could teach themselves, right? So it's all about teaching yourself. Of course, we need experts, right? For example, but like it's about teaching yourself and forming an auto-emancipation through autodidactic.
I do sympathize with that personally. Like, I know, I do. I have a touch of the autodidact myself, although it does have problems with. But it means that basically, if you learn something, and you also sort of bring the problems that you do when you learn with you. But it can be quite emancipatory, I think, just in the sheer sense that if you learn something new, you go, what else could I learn? And that's quite enabling.
For me, it's my raison d'être, right? It's my reason for existence. If I can sit and read, I don't just read philosophy, but I don't read philosophy, and understand that through writing, I don't know what I would do. So for me, I mean, I would say any academic, all right, we've been to university and through the treadmill, but before and maybe afterwards, there's a strong autodidactic aspect to our lives, right? Okay, that's how we learn, right? So, but he's saying, he doesn't say like, this is what everyone should do. He said, some people might want to do nothing. I mean, there's this, well, in Rancière's work, there's this kind of like, he's very much against Aristotle. Because, with Aristotle, everything's teleological, right? Everything has a purpose and an end. So for him, if you are to emancipate yourself, it might be that you're not going to be like Gournay and publish poetry and read philosophy. You might just not really want to do anything. You might just want to minimize your life where you're not working that much, which is, I mentioned briefly when I spoke to David, your colleague, about the Chinese lying flat movement. It's called Tongping, where people are like saying this, the new Chinese dream, a bit like the American dream, work hard. These guys are working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, but there's no chance of going forward. So they're taking much lower level jobs and working part-time, a bit like Gournay, just so they can have more time. To do what? Just to do what I want to do. It may well be lying flat. It's called the lying flat movement. Or it may be something else. But just to escape that teleology of, you could call it neoliberalism, right? Working hard as much as you can to get as much money as you can and get off that treadmill and have time to think about, what is the good life? Is this the good life? Maybe not.
The question of time is interesting there, Stuart, isn't it? Because it seems that political power stems from your ability to control someone's time. Yeah.
I mean, that's what work is all about, right? It's a giving of your time, the selling of your time. And when you get wrapped up in that, you sometimes forget, like, I mean, this is basic, but like, why am I working so hard to pay for a big mortgage on a house that I'm hardly at because I'm working, and for a car that I just drive to work, and to buy a suit and clothes that I wouldn't even need if I did this job, to have that time to pause and to think and go, well, actually, what is that good life? And that's why indirectly he doesn't talk about Rancière, but I find there's a strong link with sort of like Epicureanism, right? You know, what's the good life, right? And ataraxia is a reprieve from pain. And what is pain? I would say pain is living a neoliberal life where you're working very hard and you're not getting anywhere, but you're believing you will, right? That carrot on the stick. So,
well, that the introduction there of the Epicureans is interesting because it does draw a connection between the aesthetic and the question of art in Rancière, because, and if we hear the word aesthetic in its full sense of the word, it's a question of experience, a question of sensibility.
yeah,
And it's not just, cognitively, like, I like that painting, or I like I like that song, or Oasis are playing recently, whatever, they're brilliant.
I love Rothko.
Exactly, yeah. So it's more, yeah, the question of pleasure and pain is a political question, and that's so, yeah. So
Yeah.
in some sense, and how then is Rancière applying this question of art? So he has this distinction, doesn't he, between the what he calls the representational regime and the aesthetic regime, or the representational, the ethic, and the aesthetic. So could you maybe unpack that a little bit?
So Rancière, when he talks about aesthetics, he's not talking about, art, beauty, and the sublime. He's talking about how we configure that which we sense. And he gets to this through working through something he calls the regimes of art. There are three regimes of art. He states he was influenced by Foucault's Order of Things, where Foucault has three epistemes, yeah, where he has the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern episteme, the regimes of knowledge that form how we see the world, what we can say, what we can't say, in Foucault's early work. So he has the ethical regime, which is basically like where art resembles real life. For example, you might have a statue that resembles someone famous, or a god, if you like, a deity. Then you have the representative regime where art is mimesis, right? It's representation. And then he says the last regime from the late 18th century to today is the ascetic regime of art, okay? Where art can be anything, right? We can think of famously Duchamp and the inverted urinal, for example, and anyone can be an artist. But what he says is art, this doesn't mean that art becomes life, right? It means that life becomes art. And that's such a strong connection to Foucault, because that's what Foucault says, care of the self. So we know that the word poetry is Greek. Etymon means creation, right? Poet is a creator, and it's a creation of the self, an autopoiesis, if you like, yeah? An autopoiesis. We keep using auto a lot, right? Self-creation, and this is what he's talking about. But aesthetics for him is the configuration of the sensible. So if we take this police logic, how space and time is configured, how we're taught to sense that which we sense. So when he has politics and aesthetics together, you have the enactment of dissensus that disrupts that, and you have aesthetics as well, but as a reconfiguration of that configuration. And that's why Foucault's form of emancipation, in a nutshell, is what he calls an aesthetic heterology, meaning a space and time and a self as other. Hetero, as we know, means other, okay? An other space, another time, and the self as other, a political self, a self of dissensus, rupturing the consensual self. And that's why he believes we form this double, as he famously says with Guni. Guni plays that part of a double. He's a worker and a poet. Worker poets, going back to his Knights of Dissensus, Knights of Labour here.
Could you, because that's sort of quite technical, I think I follow you, but do you think you could give us an example of this aesthetic heterology? I think have I got that right? Does Rancière perhaps provide any examples that are illuminating on about what you're talking about?
What I'd like to do, I briefly made some notes because in his book Modern Times, he talks about how when there's like uprisings or whatever, mini revolutions, whatever you want to call them, demonstrations, he says they tend to get hijacked through a kind of far left way of seeing things. And he says we should start seeing these things through an heterological eyes. And in this, in one of the essays in Modern Times, he talks about like the Occupy movements, right? Everyone knew the Occupy movements. He said we should try and look at these through heterological eyes. So what I did is I had a look at the Manhattan Occupy movement and how it wasn't a movement of identity politics. They called themselves, the slogan was the 99%, right? With the demos, right? Which is what Rancière would say. So it's very heterological. There was also no demand for we were talking about this for equality or rights, okay? Because then Rancière would say you're putting power in someone else's hands because you're asking for something, right? Can you give us this equality? So, and because it formed and then deliquesced very soon, it fits into what Rancière's idea of what he calls aesthetic communities, right? Which are like temporary solidarities. And this is where you get this heterological time and space, and other sign that can kind of form and deliquesce and reform and adapt to emancipatory needs as we go along, rather than this concrete form that keeps continuing to some kind of telos. So it's not a politics of destination, Rancière's heterology, right? It's a politics, if you like, of dissensus.
And within that, Rancière, well, one of his things is putting equality and difference together. So he says that's what democracy makes democracy valuable. Am I right? It's a and he means active democracy. I don't think he necessarily means the institutional procedures of democracy. So I don't. I'm going to give you a quote there now. It's probably apocryphal, this, but Bismarck said it like, you don't. The thing about democracy, it's like making a sausage. Like, you might like how the sausage tastes, but you don't want to know how it's made, right? You don't want to know how the procedures,
Yeah,
and you don't want to
yeah,
go to all the committees and do all the boring stuff, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
he's
yeah.
in some sense, like Rancière is saying, actually, yeah, we should take democracy away from the sausage makers, maybe, and we should not to labour the analogy, but it's about try to marry equality and difference or differentiation at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, so this takes us back to time. For example, when he talks about democracy with the Greeks, right? He said, okay, so you had democracy in Athens, right? Well, the vast majority of the population, like women and slaves and you weren't born in Athens, didn't. But for the few that did, he said lots of them couldn't engage in direct democracy anyway because not all of them were rich, and so therefore they didn't have the time to go to these democratic, direct democratic meetings and so on. Only the few could, the rich, the wealthy, those who had time, right? So when he uses democracy, he doesn't get politically involved and, for example, talk about direct democracy, which one could argue in the vast cities that we live in, it probably much is not feasible, right? We could have maybe less of an indirect democracy, but I don't know if we could fully have a direct democracy. And as you said, a lot of people might not particularly want to get involved with that. So what he talks about is democracy as politics mode of subjectivation, right, which is a determining of the self. And then it consists of three forms. So you have a double of the self, which we spoke about. You have your consensual self, right, your social self, and the dissential self. And you have a double of reality, which is aesthetic communities, which we spoke about as like sort of temporary solidarities. And that's what kind of he delves into as democracy within this like heterologic discourse, right? This discourse of the other, another space, another time, other lives, other worlds, worlds within worlds. Okay, that I would argue are indeterminate, right? Because we don't know where they can lead. Where can they lead? So we spoke briefly about Epicurus. Let's go back. I'm sure, Patrick, you've read Lucretius, right? And the nature of the nature of things. So we talk about the swerve of the atom, right? Okay, it creates new worlds, new life, but it's indeterminate. We don't know how or where that's going to do that. And we can talk about desensitization as that. It's indeterminate. Where it will lead, we don't know. But we're living a presupposition of quality as a way of life, right? And if you think of it like Aristotle's virtue ethics, yeah, we are that which we do. So if we presuppose equality, we act accordingly, we live that. Very much in my book, I call it a way of life, quotidian activities, these everyday practices of inequality that are so imbued upon us we don't even realize, but we rupture them through practices and ways of life of equality. We become that which we do. Like Aristotle says, if you carry out courageous acts, you will become courageous. So I think there's a strong link there indirectly to Aristotle's virtue ethics. Right? You are what you do, and if you carry out these acts of presupposition equality, you will become so as an individual, but these connect to aesthetic communities, as I said, that form and deliquesce and adapt to forms of emancipation. But that directly goes against not just, like left-wing kind of forms of emancipation, but also the Enlightenment and ideas of progress, right, which we all take for granted. So it very much goes against our everyday common sense. And that's why some people maybe see it maybe not in a good light.
Rancière does put me in mind, and this is a slight digression, but I wonder what he would have made of the boule. Have you heard of the boule, Stuart, in ancient Greek? So in the ancient Greek cities.
Oh yeah, they're not slave and they're not citizen, but they're somewhere in between the two.
Kind of, yeah. So it's like so the boule was it was citizens, so it had to be citizens. So it wasn't there was those who were excluded, but it was picked by lot. It was you were picked by lottery. That was how the council was done. So it's like it's a bit like jury duty, I reckon. Like so you want to be a good citizen and stuff like that, but then you get the order. You're like, oh no, I got to lose a couple of weeks' pay here. But anyway, I think the other thing there, in terms of the Enlightenment, Foucault was the great criticizer of the illusions of enlightenment,
Yeah.
or the idea of that the Enlightenment was naturally or automatically linked with progress. Now, Rancière, he talks about the Enlightenment as well, and this is one of your key research interests, which is the question of education and the question of pedagogy, because this book by Rancière, which is a fascinating book, I read it many years ago, Stuart. It's The Ignorant Schoolmaster. And there, Rancière presents this radically different view of education. So could you tell us a little bit about that book and perhaps begin by contextualizing it in terms of the Enlightenment and perhaps the distance he's taking from a certain type of Enlightenment?
Well, as I said, we mentioned earlier about Joseph Jacotot, right? So it's basically about this 19th century pedagogue who had to flee France. He went to Belgium, and he went there to teach Belgium students French. And he had a bilingual book, and he got them to read it in Belgium, not in French, but in Dutch, right? Because Belgium's Flemish, sorry. And you reading it in French and reading it in French to try and work out the grammar and so on and so forth for themselves as an experiment. And surprise, surprise, they were able to do it, and their French improved, basically taught themselves French. Okay, with a minimalist sort of guidance from Jacotot, and this is when he comes up with this idea of like an equality of intelligence and also didactism that kind of like Rancière adopted. But I would say that maybe you'll disagree, Patrick. I don't really think this book is about pedagogy, right, and education. It's just a medium that he uses to show how society writ large is pedagogical, right? We're dumbed down, aren't we? And this goes back to technocratic, to technocracy, right? We don't understand, and only certain people understand, the experts and so on. So it's his push for people to be autodidactic in everyday life. And the book, I would say, Ignorant Schoolmaster could be strongly linked to, again, a critique against Althusser, right? This all-knowing schoolmaster to the idea of the ignorant schoolmaster, which Rancière takes on the mantle of the ignorant schoolmaster. He says, I don't know, right? I don't have an answer for emancipation like other theorists do. This is for you to do the work, right? You have these kind of like signposts, if you like, right, of dissensus and his form of democracy and aesthetics for you to work on yourself. So I would say it's more not so much for education. He's not really like, using this as a form of education. It's like a critique of the government and the world we live in as being like pedagogical. Some people know and other people act, right? Which was a critique against Althusser. He's the one who knows, and the working class are the ones who act, who do. So I think that's more where he's coming from. He doesn't really get involved education, I would say, per se. So you've got the Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire. He's not Paulo. He's not coming from that angle.
Yeah, I think the only reason I mentioned that was because, well, he does have a critique of there's a critique of Socrates in that book. It's a long time since I read it now, Stuart. It's must maybe 20 years or something like that. Like, if I remember, the idea was that he has, well, because Socrates was the thinker of ignorance as well, wasn't it? Ignorance is constitutive
Yeah,
of knowledge. And in
yeah,
Socrates' dialogue called the Meno, he teaches the slave how
mm,
to do
yeah,
Pythagoras' theorem. And I think,
yeah,
so I think Rancière's point was that that's a bad model of education because
yeah,
it's a presupposition of hierarchy. Although I suppose
yeah.
Socrates would, or Plato would respond that it's actually no. I'm showing you that slaves too can do Pythagoras' theorem. But that was my
Yeah.
only thought in terms of it being a book about teaching and a book about education or intellectual emancipation. I suppose is actually what he's talking about.
I mean, one of the key terms he uses, like stultification, right, which is right through routine and so on, just dumbs you down when you're just so bored you don't even want to think, right? Okay, and we see that every day in schools, right? Lots of students are really bored, and that's why when they had COVID and they were supposed to work from home, none of them did.
And you're a teacher as well, aren't you, Stuart? We should let the audience know that you've been a teacher, haven't you?
Yeah, yeah, and like students didn't do anything for like globally, right, for like 6 months or whatever it was, because they're stultified in school, right? And we're stultified as well. We're dumbed down in society as large by this, right? As you say yourself, in the end, you don't even want to engage with, this like, politics per se, right? Not Rancière's politics, but politics as government, because you're busy trying to survive and make a buck, right? And live a life. And you're stultified and you're so tired when you get home. That adds to the stultification as well. And so there's that strong link there with
Yes.
that's kind of what he's saying with
Well,
that
he's
book.
talking about pedagogy in the broad sense, isn't he? He's not talking about how to have good learning outcomes in university or how to teach
Yeah,
well in class. Like he's not
yeah,
telling you how to do lesson plans or things like that, but
yeah.
he's trying to give you perhaps a model of how to think about education or how to do education. So that's an interesting
Mm.
distinction that you drew there between those who know and those who know and those who act. That seems to be key to this
Mm.
theory of, so pedagogical
Act.
encounter. I suppose so pedagogy is a much more universal phenomenon than education
Mm.
or institutional education or sort of technocratic education, I suppose you would say, would allow. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, he just like he's not doesn't delve into politics, right? Politics per se, not his lexical definition. He doesn't delve into economics. He doesn't delve into education. I mean, for me, if you, I would call him. He might disagree. A philosopher of ontological emancipation, right?
Oh, what does that mean? What does that mean?
Come on now, Patrick, you can tell me. Ontological, right? So ontological, what do I mean? So I don't mean ontological in the traditional sense of the word that forms, under metaphysics, right? What's the understanding of reality and ontology? What's the understanding of being with a capital B? I mean ontology in a creative sense, like an autopoiesis, a creative ontology. Nietzsche offers us, an ontology of becoming, right? Nietzsche, so on. It's not Nietzschean. Uh, Foucault with the care of the self, right? Again, forming of the self, subjectivation. So Rancière, to me, like Foucault, are philosophers of ontological emancipation. It's not economic, it's not political in the broader understanding of that word, but it's ontological. But when it is ontological and we change how we sense things, how we exist, how we think, how we speak, what we see as the good life, then I would say that, other things like politics and so on would follow, right? But both Foucault and Rancière and the later Socrates, not the young Socrates, think about changing the self more than they do the government. And I would argue against people like Zizek and so on. We're a product of the normative, right? We're normative selves, right? So surely we need to work on ourselves if we want to, become unnormative, if you like. What will follow, we don't know, because, as I said, it's indeterminate, right? And that's why therefore you have a problem with this, right? Well, where's it even going?
You mentioned there
Yeah.
Foucault and Rancière, and this is what your book is
Yeah.
about. And I'll put a link in the show notes to
Yeah.
your book so folk can go run along and buy it
Oh,
and stuff like
brilliant.
that. But like one of the things about your book that interested me was that you put Foucault in conversation with Rancière. And I thought that was really interesting because you don't get a natural language of equality in Foucault, but that was something
No.
you think, I suppose, Rancière could supplement that, could supplement. So Rancière, I'll try again. Rancière could supplement Foucault's theory of power, perhaps. Is that right?
Well, in a core, right, I would say we know that equality and freedom as ideals do not work, right? Too much equality, there's no freedom. Too much freedom, there's no equality. So my book is an incipient offering of a synergy, right? A working together, not a sublimation. There's no dialectic here. The synergy of equality and freedom working together, not as ideals that are deferred, but as practices. So that's quite innovative in its own right. But then we put Rancière, as you said, with Foucault, because Foucault doesn't really, per se, talk about equality. I guess he believes it's a given, right? He talks about freedom, practices of freedom. But then arguably, Rancière doesn't really talk about freedom, really, does he, right? He talks about equality. So these practices of freedom and equality come together in a synergy, a working together within this emancipation as a way of life. Not philosophy as a way of life, but emancipation as a way of life.